A journey into the daily rhythms and challenges faced by ordinary people in medieval villages is offered. The vibrant tapestry of communal living, forgotten traditions, and the often harsh realities of life beyond the grand castles are unveiled. Ever wonder what life was really like in the Middle Ages, far from the kings and queens? Forget everything you think you know about medieval times, because we're stepping beyond the castle walls to uncover the gritty, fascinating daily lives of ordinary villagers. Prepare to be surprised by their ingenious solutions and the harsh realities they faced. They say the first cry of a newborn in the village echoed like a blessing, but most knew that cry might not last the winter before. Breath could become memory before limbs could carry tools. Death often arrived without a name in the medieval village. Life was not measured in years, it was measured in seasons, in harvests, in the length of a mother's tears. The average soul, if lucky, lived to see 55, but many never even learned their father's name. Disease, hunger, the cold, they were not strangers, they were neighbors. They were the wind that whispered through every wooden wall beneath thatched roofs and beside smoking hearths. Families sat close, not only for warmth, but for protection from what waited in the dark, the cough that wouldn't stop the fever that took a child at dawn, the silence of a crib too still to move. There were no hospitals, no doctors who knew what ailed the body. Only herbal women with dirt on their hands and wisdom in their eyes, and prayers whispered to saints whose bones lay in distant cathedrals, scratch from a rusty tool, a rat's bite in the night, water drawn from a fouled stream. Any one of them could carry death then. When disease came, it came not gently, it came in waves, blackened skin, swollen glands, eyes that stared without seeing. Some said it was punishment, a sin not confessed, a witch in the woods, a curse buried with the dead. Others stopped asking when your neighbor's boy dies on Tuesday and your sister by Friday. There is no room left for questions. So survival became a skill, a ritual, a quiet endurance. Children learned to work by the age of 5. To dig, to carry, to gather, to obey. A scraped knee was not a wound, it was a risk, and a broken bone could mean the grave. Mothers gave birth with women at their side, not midwives trained in cities, but hands that had buried their own infants, hands that shook from memory and hope. Fathers hunted not for sport, but because there was nothing else, and sometimes not even the forest gave enough. In winter, the village thinned, the elderly, the sick, the ones too slow to rise. Their beds grew cold, and their names faded. With the frost, the ground froze, the rivers hardened, and meat became myth bread. Stretched with husks, soups thinned. With boiling roots, bellies ached, but still the bells rang for morning prayers, because to the villager every breath was defiance, every sunrise a rebellion, and still they laughed. Yes, even in hunger, even in fear, children chased each other in muddy lanes. Old women sang over stews made of almost nothing. Men told stories beside fires they barely kept alive, because to surrender was worse. To forget joy was to die before dying. They held festivals when they could, danced with tired feet, painted their cheeks with ash and berry, made masks of straw, not because they believed in miracles, but because pretending, even for a night, made life seem kinder. And when the pox came again, when the coughing grew louder, when a boy collapsed mid-sentence, in the field they buried him, wrapped in cloth, lowered into the same earth that fed them and They prayed not for wealth, not for long life, but for enough food to see the next day, enough health to hold a child, enough strength to light the next fire. And always there was the church stone and silent watching. It offered hope and guilt and ritual, a place to confess, to mourn, to kneel beside candles, and wonder why they lived in a world where faith was not a comfort, it was a necessity. When death comes every season, you must believe in something, a sign in the stars, a miracle in the woods, a saint watching from a cracked painting on the wall. Levin, the silence had weight. At night, when the wind groaned through the shutters, when wolves howled from distant trees, the village listened, hearts pressed, tight hands gripping rosaries made of bone or wood, because no one knew what would come tomorrow. And yet the village endured it, always endured, not from strength, but from memory, from love, from stubborn blood. The fields were plowed again, children were born again, songs were sung again, if whispered, even if barely heard, because survival was the greatest story they ever told. And every villager, every soul who bent over a sick child, who chopped wood with shaking hands, who knelt beside a grave and still rose the next morning, they were heroes, not of war but of life itself, in a world built on suffering. They made something sacred from scrap sand. The story does not end here, because as the winds shift, as the crops struggle, as another illness waits beyond the tree lines, a nothing stirs in the village, not despair, but resilience, a quiet voice passed from mother to daughter, father to son. We endure. We always have, but what happens when the earth stops giving, when the rains don't come, when hunger isn't seasonal but permanent? The next chapter is not survival, it is famine. And famine is not just the absence of food. Not all stories begin in castles. Not all power lies behind stone walls. To understand the truth of the medieval world, you must begin not with kings, but with the mud, the village alive with smoke and shouting, with the scent of dung and baking rye, with the soft whimper of goats tied to fence posts, and the sudden laughter of barefoot children splashing through puddles left by a spimza. Air hums with flies and voices, and hunger. Wooden homes lean like tired elders, thatched roofs sag beneath the weight of rain, and rot fences made of bent twigs and prayer chickens dart between feet, and everywhere there is motion. Rough hands mending nets, beating cloths, sharpening sides on stone. This is not the world of polished halls and golden goblets. This is the pulse beneath the crown, the breath beneath the banner. The mud tells its own story, of footsteps layered over centuries, of carts dragging harvests half lost to the wind, of hooves and spilled milk and urine from a sick sheep. It clings. 2 boots, 2 hems, 2 birth and burial alike. The castle may rise above it all, clean and distant, its towers proud, its banners flapping in winds too high to smell the soil. But down here, among the thatch and timber, is where the heartbeat of the realm truly lives. The village breathes in rhythm with the seasons, in tune with the tolling bell far beyond the trees. Its people wake before the sun, their fingers cracked and blackened by soil and soot. They know the names of every cloud, the signs in the bark, the voice of the crows. Before a storm here, a woman bends over a tub of steaming linens. Her knuckles red her breath, a whisper of fog. She hums a tune learned from her mother, a lullaby for the dead or the living. No one is sure anymore there. A boy chases a stolen egg, laughed at by the others tripping through manure. He will cry, then laugh too. Because here, even a broken egg is a moment worth remembering at the edge of the village. A smith hammers iron into shape. Sparks dance like tiny spirits, each strike a hymn to endurance. He does not speak as he works, but his rhythm is the same each morning. And that too is a kind of prayer in the center. The well gurgles with life. Women gather buckets, scraping stone. Their chatter, a blend of gossip and warning. Who is ill? Whose cow spurts? Whose son saw the priest's cart pass too fast down the road? There are no secrets here, only silence that grows loud when the church bell doesn't ring. The smells are thick boiled cabbage, animal dung, wet wool, and sometimes, if the wind favors fresh bread, no perfume hides the truth. No lavender in these lanes, only the raw scent of effort. Baby wails behind a woven curtain. A man curses the dullness of his blade. Someone sings, not for joy, but because silence makes sorrow louder. The colors are not gray. No, they are deep earth tones, stained with life green moss on fences. Brown cloaks patched with yellow thread, red clay, streaked across skin, blue ribbons, kept hidden for feast days. The village is not dead, it is alive in its struggle. It is sacred in its mess. Look beyond the mud, and you see pride, not the pride of knights, but of mothers who keep 4 children fed on half a loaf, of boys who mend their father's boots before school of elders. Who remember 3 winters ago when the river froze solid and still they danced? There is no marble, no polished brass, no silence clean enough to hear your own heartbeat. This is not the court. This is not the castle. Here words are shouted across fields, not whispered behind veils. Justice is the tilt of a head, the quiet forgiveness of a neighbor who lends you grain, and yet, above it all, the stone castle watches, cold, distant. A world awaits, courtyards swept clean, its floors scrubbed by servants who do not smile. Its silence heavy, its air thin, sterile, as if untouched by hunger or birth. But they need this mud. The lords, the ladies, they drink the grain raised in this filth. They wear wool spun by cracked fingers. They eat cheese salted by women who have never seen a throne. The castle is a crown, but the village is the neck, and it has learned how to bear weight even when it bends. It does not break. Traveler might scoff, might cover their nose, might compare this place to a pigsty, but stay a day, feel the fire in a shared bowl of broth, hear the story told at dusk about a fox that tricked a priest. Watch a father carry his sick daughter without complaint, and you will see this is not filth. This is foundation. This is not chaos. It is community. Raw, unfiltered, unrefined, and it is beautiful because it is real. And as the sky begins to darken, as the villagers light their torches, as children are called inside by mothers whose eyes have seen too much, the mud deepens, the fires crackle, and the village holds its breath for one more night. Tomorrow may bring rain or fire or famine, but tonight they are here, alive together. And somewhere beyond the trees, the castle windows flicker, unaware, unmoved, unchanged. But down here where the wind is thick, with breath and baking smoke, the real world turns, and it turns in mud. The cold came first, before the light, before the rooster's cry, before the bellet crept in through every crack in the wall. It clung to blankets like a curse. It bit into toes and fingers. Long before breath turned to mist in the Aran, the medieval village, the day did not begin with choice. It began with necessity. Child stirred beside a mother, pressed tight to a father whose snore was the only warmth left. Frost gathered on the inside of shutters, and the straw beneath the bed crunched like old leaves. There was no luxury in waiting, no time for slow rising. The fire had died in the night, and with it, the promise of comfort. The first to rise were the women. They moved like ghosts through the cold, wrapping shawls over bare skin, reaching for kindling with numb hands, coaxing the embers back to life with breath and prayer and desperation. The hearth was not just heat, it was survival. It was the center of everything: cooking, washing, worship, birth, death, fanned. So they fed it first, even before feeding themselves in a corner. Children groaned and clung to sleep, but the sound of pots clanging, the smell of ash and oats, drew them from the strath amid. Rose slower muscles, stiff joints, aching, but work called, and work did not wait outside. The sun was just a hint, a blush on the edge of the sky. Not warmth, not yet, just light enough to see the frost steaming from the rooftops. And then came the bell-distant iron, unforgiving. It called not just the pious, but all to kneel, to cross themselves, to mutter the same words their fathers spoke, and their fathers before them. The village moved as one towards the chapel, or the open square, where a traveling priest might speak beneath a wooden cross, where a mother might whisper her own liturgy, too poor for Latin, too tired for kneeling. But no less sacred communal prayer was not an event. It was ritual, it was armor. It was the one moment of stillness before the day fractured into toilsome. Prayed for the sick, some for a good harvest, some for forgiveness, some simply prayed for less pain. They prayed with cracked lips, with eyes red from smoke, with children squirming at their sides, with hunger already waking in their bellies. The church itself stood like a weary guardian, its stones cold, its floor worn smooth by knees and time. Inside, candles sputtered, icons wept dust, and yet it felt holy, not for grandeur, but for the breath it sheltered. Day shepherd prayed for his flock, a baker for dry grain, a girl for her dying brother, a boy for the courage to speak again. And when the last word fell, when the final amen faded into smoke, the village did not linger, because prayer did not plow fields, prayer did not bake bread, prayer did not chop wood or mend roofs or fetch water from the frozen stream. They turned back to their homes, to the hearths, to the fires that still fought the cold, and in those flames there was memory of those lost the winter before, of those too weak to rise, that morning of promises made and broken. In the cold breakfast was no feast, porridge, thick and gray bread, too hard to chew, but shared with hands rough from labor, and that made it enough. Children ate crouched on stools, mothers fed infants in silence, fathers watched the sky for signs of snow or, worse, rain. Outside, life began again. The blacksmith lit his forge, the shepherd whistled his dogs, the washerwoman broke ice to soak linens, and all of it hinged on that first hour, on the warmth wrestled from frozen wood, on the whispered words spoken before work, on the rising of the village, not as individuals, but as one, because in the cold togetherness was power. A single hearth meant nothing but many fires burning. That was a signal to the world: we are still here, we wake, we pray, we endure. As the sun finally rose, spilling golden light over sodden paths and steaming rooftops, the village shimmered, not in splendor, but in defiance. For every breath was hard-won, every movement an act of faith. This was not the age of ease. This was the age of ritual, of repetition, of sacred habitat. The morning, though cruel, was holy. It shaped them, bound them, carried them, manned Now, as the smoke rises, as the tools are lifted, as the children run barefoot into the thawing mud, the day begins, and somewhere, beyond the fields, beyond the chapel, beyond the reach of morning prayer, the castle sleeps still, but the village is awake. Not all heroes wore iron, some wore soot, some wore burlap, some wore nothing but calluses and the scent of earth that clung even in sleep to. Walk through a medieval village was to walk through the beating heart of labor. Not labor as choice, but labor as identity, as tradition, as survival. The farmer rose before the sun, not for glory, not for gold, but because the soil waited. And the soil did not care for dreams. He was mud-stained before the dew had lifted, bent low beneath sacks of barley hands, gripping tools worn smooth by his father's grip and his father's before, that he did not read, but he read the sky, he read the wind, he read the worms that surfaced too soon. The plow was his altar, the oxen his choir, the harvest his gamble and win. The crops failed, as they sometimes did. He did not scream, he tilled again, because famine could be endured, but surrender could note a few doors down. A hammer sang in rhythm, the blacksmith at his forge back curved like a question, forearms thick as tree roots. Each strike was a note, each spark a hymn. He did not speak often, he did not need to. His language was iron, and the village listened. Hoes and nails, plowshares and hinges, knives for butchers, hooks for shepherds, needles for the midwife chains. For the Lord's jailer every flame he fed, every blade he shaped held the weight of lives that would never thank him. He stood in heat that melted flesh, but never flinched, because he knew if he faltered, so would the rest. Beyond the forge, the weaver sat hunched in a sea of thread fingers, dancing faster than thought, a symphony of shuttle and spin. She knew each thread by feel, not by sight. Wool from village sheep, dyed with herbs and ash, spun into cloaks, into tunics, into wedding cloth and funeral wraps. Her loom groaned with effort, but sang with Butashi. Knew the stories woven into every length, the widow's shawl, the newborn's swaddle, the pattern passed down from a grandmother's grandmother, not for style, but for remembrance. And nearby, the cooper carved barrels for ale, the potter shaped earth into bowls, the thatcher climbed roofs with straw tied in bundles, the miller ground grain in his great roaring wheel, and the carpenter built not homes, but legacies. Each trade, each calloused hand, each voice raised in the morning was not a profession, it was breath, it was belonging. There were no resumes, no choices to explore. You did what your father did, what your mother taught, what the land demanded. On still there was Pride, a boy holding his first scythe, a girl learning to dye linen without staining her fingers, an apprentice wiping sweat from his brow as his master finally said, "Good enough." They were not nameless, not to each other. The economy was not coin, it was trust, it was barter. It was a wheel of effort, turning with slow but certain grace. The smith needed the farmer needed the cooper needed the weaver needed the sheep, and the sheep needed all of them to survive. It was not perfect. There were quarrels, there were jealousies, but above all, there was interdependence. If one fell, all trembled on. Still they worked through winter frost, through aching backs, through hunger and plague and war, because the work was not just for themselves. It was for the children watching from the doorway, for the ancestors buried in the fields, for the village that only lived because they did. Their tools were their heritage, their sweat, their testimony. Cobbler's knife, a butcher's hook, a midwife's herbs, all sacred in the hands that wielded the mand. Yet the castle rarely noticed the lords dined on bread kneaded by hands they never touched, rode horses shoed by men they never named, drank wine aged in barrels they never knew were carved by boys with splinters in their palms. But the village knew, the village remembered, and when the blacksmith died, they carried him not as a man, but as a cornerstone. When the weaver passed, they draped her casket in the cloth she made for others. When the farmer's field lay fallow after his final breath, the children gathered to plant in silence, so the land would not forget him. Their work was never easy, never done, but always holy, because in this world survival was a trade, and each of them a master. And now, as the sun lowers behind the trees, and smoke rises from chimneys shaped by calloused hands, the village rests, but the tools remain near the threads, half woven, the forge still warm, the fields watching, waiting ready, because tomorrow the work begins. Again, it is not just labor, it is legacy. Hunger was a familiar shadow. It slept beside them, woke with them, walked with them through the fields, and lingered long after the fire had burned. Low food was never guaranteed, not in the village, not for the poor, not for the ordinary. It was work. It was timing, it was mercy from the weather and faith and soil that did not always love them back. The morning began with bread, not soft, not sweet, but heavy, hard, baked from rye or barley, blackened by ash, sometimes stretched with sawdust or ground. Beans, when flour ran, low children gnawed it with small teeth. Mothers softened it in broth. Fathers broke it with hands that knew what starvation felt like. Beside the bread, a pot of pottage, boiled over the hearth until it thickened like glue, a slow stew of whatever could be found. Onions and leeks, turnips and nettles, a handful of beans, a pinch of herbs. If luck or land allowed, meat was rare. And when it came, it was salted, smoked, preserved, like a treasure. Pigs were too valuable to eat. Often chickens gave eggs, cows gave milk, and so death came only when they could give, no more when they did kill. Nothing was wasted. Feet, organs, blood, all stirred into stews, stuffed into skins, hung over fire to dry. They ate with gratitude, and silenced the rich feasted. But the villagers made do, and in making do, they found invention. A stale crust, soaked in broth, became a filling meal. A cabbage leaf wrapped around barley became something almost festive. A wild apple boiled with honey was a taste remembered for weeks in summer. The table brightened. Fresh peas, berries from the hedgerow leaves, crisp and green fish pulled from rivers, roasted over flame, with skin that crackled and bones picked clean. Autumn brought the harvest, the one true feast of the year. Barrels filled with ale cakes, made with honey nuts, roasted in iron pans, pies thick with roots and meat. If fortune favored for one night, the village would forget the hunger. They would sing, drink, dance with oil on their lips and crumbs on their chins, but they knew it would not. Last winter was cruel. The ground froze, the hens slowed, the goats gave lessened, the meals returned to broth. 2 salted scraps, 2 crusts scraped clean. A child might go to bed with nothing, a mother might eat less, so her infant could feed. The fire was warm, but the belly was hollow, and still they created. They fermented, preserved, boiled, baked, mixed bark with flour, moss, with broth, anything to stretch the meal one more night. They seasoned with ash, with vinegar, with prayers. The tools were crude, a clay pot, a wooden spoon, a pan, passed down from the last famine, but in their hands. Even hunger became a kind of art, and in their silence, a kind of reverence, because food was not just sustenance, it was survival, it was memory. It was community they shared when they could split loaves between neighbors, brought broth to the sick. Let the old man eat first. The feast in the village was not about abundance. It was about togetherness. 1 chicken, 10 mouths, and still they let. When the bell tolled for feast days, for saints or weddings or harvest rites, the smells changed. Sweet buns with dried fruit, ale that warmed the throat, pies shaped like stars, tables crowded with borrowed bowls and borrowed joy. And for a moment the hunger left them, but not for long. They did not complain, because to complain was to waste breath, and breath was precious, so they chewed in silence, drank what they had prayed before and after, and sometimes during, because even a bowl of thin gruel could be sacred, fed them, bound them, kept them from breaking. And in the dark, when the wolves howled, when the snow crept in beneath the door, when the baby would not stop crying, a warm bowl in the hand, a cup of ale passed from one shaking hand to another. That was hope, that was life, that was enough. And when the sun rose again, they would start over forage, plant milk, baked not for pleasure, but for the right to endure. And in enduring, they became more than hungry peasants. They became alchemists of the earth, masters of little keepers of tradition. And the fire, always the fire, would burn in the hearth, where a mother stirred her pot, a father sliced his last onion, a child waited for whatever came next, and whatever it was, they would eat it and be grateful, because to eat was to live, and to live was to fight back. In the heart of every medieval village, there was order, not the kind written in scrolls or sealed by kings, but the kind enforced by duty, by birth, by whispered custom. A world where every face knew its place, and every name carried weight. At the top stood not a lord, for he lived far beyond the fields, but his shadow walked among them, wore the badge of the reeve. The reeve was no noble. He was chosen from the people, elected or coerced, feared or followed, but always obeyed. He was the watchman of the fields, the keeper of order, the voice of the Lord. When the Lord was absent, which was always, he measured grain, counted sheep, settled quarrels, summoned men for labor, and reminded them who owned the soil beneath their bare feet. They called him a peasant, but he stood taller than the restand beside the reeve. In power, not of man, but of heaven, walked the priest. He held no blade, wielded no tax, but his tongue could condemn, and his prayers could save. He was the shepherd of souls, the keeper of sacraments. He baptized the newborn, buried the dead, heard the sins whispered between splinters of the confessional. His power was not loud, but deep, carved into minds, since cradle, feared even by those who mocked him at the tavern. When the plague came, they ran to him. When the sky cracked with thunder, they knelt before his altar. And so the priest ruled hearts, while the reeve ruled hands. But there were others, quiet powers, hidden beneath soot and sweat. The miller, with flour on his arms and silver in his palm, he ground the village's grain. And sometimes the trust that came with Ith took his toll, a handful here, a measure there, and always more than he should. But none dared stop him, for bread came through his door, and hunger obeyed. His wheel the blacksmith muscles, thick as oaks, made shoes for oxen, nails for doors, plows that carved the land. They said, even the devil feared a blacksmith's forge, for iron bent only to fire and will, and both burned within him the carpenter built the walls, the thatcher covered the roof, the weaver spun warmth from thread, each a spoke in the wheel, each essential, yet each still beneath the yoke. Then came the field hands, the herders, the dung scrapers, those whose names were not remembered, but whose backs bore the weight of the entire world. Children who picked stones, mothers who spun by firelight, old men who hobbled behind plows until their bones gave way. Did not rise, they did not command, they endured, and in the tavern after the labor they all became equal ale, blurred the lines that daylight carved. But morning came, and the reeve demanded service, and the priest demanded virtue, and the miller demanded grainon. So the wheel turned again. Each knew their place, each feared to fall lower, for beneath the lowest rung there was only silence. Yet among them all power was not always loud. The old widow with herbs in her pouch, the midwife who brought life into blood-soaked straw, the blind fiddler who made children dance and mothers weep. They held a different kind of power, one not written, one not taxed, but remembered. And so the village breathed in layers, some ruled by land, some by faith, some by silence, but all served something: the Lord, the church, the land itself. And if any forgot their place, the village reminded them, not with swords, but with stares, with silence, with exile, because order meant survival. And survival was sacred, so they bowed when they must, knelt when they must, labored when they must, labored for winter, for harvest, for judgment. Each in their place, each a thread woven into a tapestry of mud and ash, and duty not equal, not free, but alivened. For many, that was enough. Not every day in the medieval village was shadow and toil. Not every life was only mud and hunger. There were days when laughter spilled into the streets, when bells rang not for death or prayer, but for joy feast. Days, holy days, the rare moments when time itself seemed to pause, and even the poorest soul could taste something close to freedom. They danced, they sang, they forgot for a while that their hands were cracked, and their bellies often hollow. Communal fires burned in the village. Green spits turned with roasted meat, rare and precious ale flowed. Thick bread, warm and shared, without tally or tax. It was not abundance, but it was enough to make them believe in something more than survival. Children chased each other through the smoke of roasting lamb. Old women hummed songs older than memory. Men clapped and stomped their feet, pounding rhythm into the earth that fed them. There was music, always music, fiddles and flutes, drums made of hide, voices rising together like prayer, though no priest led them. The harvest festival was sacred in its own way, not for saints or kings, but for the wheat, the apples, the simple miracle of having enough to last the winter. They crowned a harvest queen, adorned her in garlands, sang songs of gratitude, not to God alone, but to the land, to their own endurance. Weddings were wild. A whole village would celebrate, not just two souls joining, but two families, two lineages of labor binding together for survival. And when a child was born, they gathered not just to bless, but to witness, because each new voice in the village meant the story would continue on. Midsummer's Eve, they lit fires to chase away the shadows. They leaped over flames, laughed in defiance of death, warded off the evil they could never name but always felt. Even funerals in their sorrow were gatherings, a final feast, a sharing of memories and meat, and the reminder that they were not alone together. That was how they endured, not as lords or legends, but as neighbors in song, in story. In the touch of rough hands offering bread, their joy was not loud, not lavish, but defiant, because when you live each day beneath the weight of famine, war, and plague, laughter becomes an act of rebellion. So they danced harder, sang louder, held each other closer, because they knew no one survives alone. Knowledge in the medieval village did not live on parchment. It lived in hands, in tongues, in memory. There were no libraries. No scrolls passed from monk to child. No golden halls of learning where questions could blossom into wisdom. But there was. The blacksmith's hammer passed from father to son. There was the weaver's loom, where a girl learned by rhythm before she learned prayer. There was the grandmother, bent with time, who told tales by firelight, stories of wolves, of saints, of spirits. In the trees, and with each word, a lesson, a warning, a fragment of truth wrapped in myth. A village, taught in silence, in repetition, in calloused palms, and quiet, I say, child, learned by doing, by watching, by failing, and trying again. Was the classroom, the forge, the fields, the kitchen, all carried their own wisdom. And each elder was a book written in scars. To read was a privilege, to write a miracle few could do either. The priest could, the reeve perhaps, but for most knowledge flowed like water, cupped in rough hands, slipping away, if not passed quickly, to another. Yet, in their own way, they were scholars. The healer who knew which root soothed fever. The midwife who heard death or life in a mother's cry. The shepherd who could read the sky better than any ink-stained sculptural tradition. Was their scripture, their science, their survival land, in their stories, their songs, their customs. They carried the world generation to generation through storms, through plagues. Through the long silence of winter they remembered, because memory was the only school that never closed, and though no scribe recorded their names, they left behind a lineage of knowledge as vital, as enduring as any king's decree. Justice in the medieval village wore no blindfold. It wore a scowl. It wore the face of a neighbor. It wore the breath of fear. There were no distant judges in powdered wigs, no polished courtrooms with echoing gavels. The court was held on the village, green under the open sky, in front of all who had eyes to see and ears to whisper. The reeve would stand. The priest might bless, but the people watched, and the people remembered. Crime was not just a wound to law, it was a wound to order, to God, to survival. Stolen chicken could mean hunger, a broken fence could mean lost sheep, a lie could fracture trust that took generations to build. So justice was swift, and often brutal. Trial by fire, trial by water, trial by pain. A woman accused of theft might walk barefoot over burning irons. If her wounds festered, she was guilty. If they healed clean, she was spared by the mercy of God, they said. Or perhaps by luck or skill or silence. Say, man accused of murder might be tied and thrown into the river if he sank. He was innocent if he floated. The devil held him up. There were stocks for shame, ropes for thieves, axes for worsome punishments. Lived in the flesh, a branded hand, a split ear. Others lived in exile, banished from the only world they knew. But justice was not only fear, it was theater, a public ritual of survival, a warning, a reminder that peace must be carved out with discipline and kept with blood. The village needed order, even if that order groaned with injustice, even if the innocent sometimes fell beneath its weight. There were no appeals, no higher court, only God, and the memory of the crowd. Day child would watch a neighbor shamed in stocks and learn that the village forgets slowly, that one mistake could echo longer than a life. But even in this darkness, there were whispers of mercy, an elder who defended the weak, a priest who pleaded for the soul of the condemned. a mother's cry that softened a sentence, because justice in the medieval village was not about right, it was about balance, about fear and obedience, about keeping the fragile thread of the village unbroken, and beneath the watchful eyes of stone crosses and silent trees, the people learned to walk carefully, to speak carefully, to live carefully, for justice came not in scrolls, but in fire, in water, in silent sand. Everyone was always watching. Asterisk. The church bell rang before the sun, and long after it fell behind the woods. Its sound was not just a call to worship, it was a spine, a rhythm, a warning. The church was everywhere, in the bread, in the birth, in the silence, after death, the thatched chapel stood like a guardian cloaked in smoke and sacred dust, wooden beams darkened by candle soot, a floor worn smooth by the knees of generations. It was the first place a child would cry, their skin kissed by holy water in the name of salvation. And it was the last place their body would lie, wrapped in cloth, cloaked in incense, offered to God with trembling hands. The priest was no mere figure in robes. He was law, he was knowledge, he was fear. He held the scriptures in a tongue the villagers could not read yet. They obeyed every word. He knew their secrets. He heard their sins. He spoke of hell in winter and forgiveness in spring. He blessed the fields before sowing. He damned the storm. When crops drowned, he warned against witches and whispered tales of saints who bled for truth. To defy the priest was to defy the divine, and to defy the divine was to risk both harvest and soul. The church shaped the week. Sunday bells, holy days, saints, feasts, fasting, and firelight, meat, forbidden bread. Broken, a rhythm that no one questioned, because to question was to wander into darkness. It told them who they were, why they suffered, why the plague took children, why the Lord ruled, why silence was safer than doubt inside the chapel. Light fell like grace through narrow windows. Dust danced in shafts of gold. Mothers wept quietly. Old men crossed themselves with trembling fingers. A child stared at the crucifix, not understanding, but fearing, and somehow that was enough. The church was comfort and cage, hope and threat. It offered answers, even when those answers came wrapped in fire. And Janet taught that life was suffering, that the meek would inherit a heaven they had never seen, and that sin was everywhere, in a woman's hair, in laughter, on feast days, in thoughts that curled like smoke and left no trace. Yet despite the fear, despite the weight, it held them together in the darkest nights. When wolves howled and children burned with fever, they clung to crosses, they whispered prayers, they lit candles for those they could not save. Because if the church was control, it was also survival. It gave death meaning. It gave hunger purpose. It gave the poor something. Even the Lord could not take Casaland, so they knelt. Every man, every woman, every child, before the altar, before the priest, before the silent sand. In that silence, between the hymns, between the punishments and prayers, they built a life. They feared what they could not see, and so they named it the Pax, the wasting, the evil eye whispers. Born in wind, blame stitched into Schwittelon. Before the priest arrived with scripture, they had their own gospel carved in bark, buried beneath doorways, hung in dried herbs from the beams of their homes, a charm of rowan. On the threshold, a bag of nettle beneath a sick child's bed. A prayer not from the Bible, but from the woods, passed from mother to daughter. Like fire in the dark, they walked both paths, the church by day, the old ways by night, crosses over cribs, salt at the corners of the cottage, ashes spread in a circle before planting them. Midwife knew them best, not just where to press for pain, but which moon was safest for birth, she whispered. Spells while boiling water, she sang old rhymes as she crushed roots and bone no one questioned, because she had seen too many babies born blue, and too many mothers bleed into earthwind cows. Sickened, they blamed spirits in the fog when crops failed. It was the curse of a jealous neighbor when sleep brought nightmares. They said a hag sat upon the chest, stealing breath by candlelight, and yet they prayed to saints, to the Virgin, to something older than either holy. Water was splashed on doorways, but so was animal blood. Wreaths of garlic hung beside crucifixes, iron horseshoes nailed beneath windows, symbols drawn in chalk before the cock's cray. Hedgehog seen at dawn, a raven perched 3 nights a dream of teeth falling, all meant something, and those meanings kept them alive, or at least made the dying make sense. The priest condemned such things as heresy, but when his own sister fell sick, he asked the herbwoman for a poultice and lit a candle in every corner of the chapel because faith was one kind of survival and superstition was another. This was a world where heaven loomed above, but something else breathed in the trees, in the wells, in the bones of forgotten stones, buried beneath their fields. They feared the devil, yes, but they feared their grandmother's warning more. Never cut your nails on a Sunday. Never whistle after dusk. Never step over the sleeping because some things were older than Scripture, and older things rarely forget. There were winters when the earth gave nothing, no barley, no bread, just silence in the fields and ribs showing through the skin of children. Famine came not as a single storm, but as a season that refused to pass, and they endured it with clenched teeth, with bark ground into flour, with soup made of nettles and prayer. Then came plague not once, but again and again, a darkness that crept beneath the skin that took the old, the young, the ones in between. No village untouched, no hearth unwounded. They watched neighbors cough blood onto straw. They dug graves until the earth would no longer open. Izalith, the church bell, never stopped ringing. And still they lived. They marked their doors with chalk. They wore herbs at their throats. They burned lavender and screamed psalms into the sky. Some turned to God, others to the forest, most to whatever would listen. And when the soldiers came, with banners flapping like torn wings and iron on their boots, fields were trampled, livestock stolen, the barn set alight just to prove it could be. Fathers buried their tools and took up clubs. Boys hid in cellars, clutching knives carved from firewood. Mothers ran into the woods with infants pressed to their chests. Silence became survival, but rage was never far behind, and yet they rebuilt after plague. They planted again after fire. They raised beams toward the sky after war. They found laughter again beside the well, softer than before, but real. They stitched together what was broken, not with gold, but with habit, with hope, with the stubbornness only the poor can know. They passed down stories of the hungry years, of the black cough of the night the mill burned, not to mourn, but to remember, so that the next generation would not be soft wood, not forget what was paid just to stay alive. And so in each stone set in a cottage wall, in each calloused palm gripping a hoe, in each lullaby sung over an empty cradle, was proof that no matter what came, they would endure. Not all revolutions roar. Some whisper through wooden wheels, through iron plows pulled by sweating oxen, through the slow turning of a millstone. beside a murmuring streaming, the great halls of history. The kings are named, the battles sung, but in the village it was the wheeled cart that saved a back from breaking, the scythe that sang through barley, the watermill that turned grain to life. These were the quiet miracles, the overlooked genius of knee-day padded yoke upon a shoulder, a loom that clicked and creaked in the hands of a weaver, a clay oven set deep in the earth to hold warmth through winter, each tool humble but holy in its own wave, iron-shod plow, heavy and curved, cut deep into stubborn soil where the old wooden scratch plows failed. It allowed wheat to grow where once only weeds rose. It meant full stomachs. It meant spring would not mean starvation. And the windmill, spinning arms like a god's fingers, it tamed the sky itself, pulled from it the power to grind, to lift, to breathe life into stillness. There was the potter's wheel, the carpenter's lathe, the beeskips, woven of straw and hope tools, passed from father to son, from mother to daughter. Each one a key, not to conquest, but to survival, even the humble. Sickle, its curve shaped by centuries, was a symbol of endurance, of labor shared and bread earned, of sweat traded for peace. These were not machines of glory. They would never ride to war, but they built what armies could not: continuity, resilience. Home, and now so many are forgotten, buried not in earth but in silence. Yet if you listen, you can still hear the wheel turning, the hammer tapping, the grain falling like rain into the milthies, where the quiet architects of the Middle Ages, not cast in bronze, but carved in oak, sewn into linen, hung on the walls of cottages like sacred tools. Then, through them, the village endured, not by might, but by making, by mending, by mastering the ordinary. And so the next time the chronicles speak of knights and kings, remember the iron hoe, the spinning wheel, the hearthstone warmed by clever hands. That is where history truly lived. The village may be gone, its fields grown wild, its timbers long since rotted to soil, but its spirit lives on, not in ruins, but in rhythm. In words we speak without knowing where they came from, in customs we follow without remembering who first showed. Usta, way we gather at tables, celebrate the turn of seasons, the way neighbors still lean on each other in times of loss or joy. These are echoes of the medieval hearth, of the shared fire, of bread broken between calloused hands. Our surnames whisper, it's Smith, Baker, Miller, names carved from craft, passed like torches through time. Even the shape of our towns, with churches at the center, streets spiraling like old wagon ruts, carries the imprint of those who lived by plow and prayer, by the ring of the village bell and the rhythm of sunrise work and sunset rest. The games we play, the sayings we repeat, the quiet reverence we hold for weddings, for funerals, for harvest. It all threads back to that Temea time of hardship, yes, but also of immense human ingenuity, of deep-rooted connection, where no one survived alone, and every task was shared in the laughter of a festival, in the hush of a winter night, in the ritual of planting a garden, or the telling of a story by firelight. We are not so different. The wheel has turned, but the path remains on it. So we invite you not just to look back, but to look within, to see in the life of the medieval villager a reflection of your own daily rituals, your own community, your own struggle and celebration. Though their world was bounded by forest and faith, by superstition and survival, they dreamed as we do, loved as we do, hoped as we doned. In their humble footsteps we still walk.